You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 268 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Going to be talking about the midterm elections on today's show. It's not something I really discussed in the lead up to the elections, although it has been a huge topic when you're looking at what's covered on the TV and what's in your social media feeds. And so I'm going to be talking about that, and is it worth voting, and all this other kind of stuff surrounding the midterm elections. For those of you who could take the time to share the show, you could find all my work, not just this podcast. This includes my daily news roundup at the Libertarian Institute. So just go, the URL there is libertarianinstitute.org, and check out and share all of my work. Also want to take the time to thank the people who are supporting this show. The support I'm getting on Patreon is quite amazing. And thank you all for taking the time to do that. I have now a donor of more than $5 a month. And so I would like to find out, things that I could do for my listeners. If you want to donate 10, 15 or more a month, I'm willing to offer, maybe separate kinds of analysis shows, more shows open to just the patrons. So if you want to donate to the show, but you're looking for a reason, send me an email, a message on Twitter. My Twitter handle is at KYAAALE, and let me know what you think, what I should do on Patreon. The URL there is patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, midterm election stuff. So I think the biggest thing I could say is I really don't think this is going to make a huge difference on foreign policy issues. I mean, the midterm elections are such a big deal, or at least made to be such a big deal in American politics, and, are supposed to weigh heavily on all these really important issues, that, the ripple effect from their perceived importance, I think, impacts all aspects. And so, when you're looking at the U.S. trying to look maybe a little bit more harsh on Saudi Arabia leading up till today's elections, I think that's a real, impact on the U.S. foreign policy, and could possibly explain why General Maz called for Saudi Arabia to come to a ceasefire in Yemen in the next 30 days. I will say that I didn't go out and vote today. I live in a state and in a district where there's really not much of a question who's going to be my congressman and senator. I will say, I guess it could be worse if I lived in a district with somebody really dedicated and vocal about the anti-war, non-interventionist, or generally just opposed to rabid U.S. imperialism. I would probably go out and vote for that person. So, Tulsi Gabbard, Thomas Massey, Justin Amash. That said, my senator, as one of them, is Elizabeth Warren, who's not terrible on some issues. She has been a little bit more vocal about Yemen in the past 3 or 4 months. And, that's been nice. Of course, it's 3 years too late and absolutely inexcusable that she wasn't standing up to Barack Obama and trying to say, look, I'm so much more liberal than you and so much more progressive than you. I care about these poor Yemeni people that you're helping to starve to death. But, it's partisan and silence at that point. But at least now that there is a Republican in charge, she's, kind of standing up. I also think that she was a little bit offended by the Pentagon lying to her and to the Senate about their involvement in the war in Yemen, specifically the deployment of U.S. Special Forces troops to southern Saudi Arabia. My congresswoman has signed on to be a co-sponsor of the new War Powers Act for the Yemen war. So, I have to give her, a little credit for that. Although, and I think this is, representative of the overall problem in Congress, none of her pages include even a mention of foreign policy. And, this is one of the huge roles of the U.S. government. Now, I understand that many of her constituents care more about Medicaid for all or, gun rights positions and all this other stuff. And she's a liberal, so, I don't agree with all that. But at the same time, it would be nice to see and be able to find on her page at least a section of what her foreign policy beliefs are. Does she support the war in Afghanistan continuing on. We had another service member die there recently and another insider attack. I believe this is the ninth U.S. personnel to die in Afghanistan this year. We're itching up on $1 trillion spent on that war and untold numbers of dead Afghanis to go along with the 2,400 or more U.S. troops that have died there. And it's really inexcusable that, Congress can take a minute to look at a new authorization for use of military force and figure out what they want to do with the Afghan war as it's entered its 17th year. I mean, the Constitution does assign this responsibility to the Congress, and I'm not necessarily a diehard constitutionalist libertarian. However, when you are looking at what the mechanisms should be to end a war, Congress is the one kind of established in the cultural procedures laid out for us in the Constitution there. And so by petitioning our Congress, they should, take stance on these issues. However, they really don't, and they just continue to allow the executive to do whatever they want. If you look at deployment of U.S. forces in Niger or in Somalia, these are, under the 2001 AUMF that Congress explicitly assigned the, president the right to go after the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and they're using it in Central and East Africa. This is, completely insane and obviously out of bounds, yet nobody, even bats an eye and does anything. You have a very rare occasion where you have so much as a House hearing. One, in fact, was hosted by Barbara Lee and I believe Justin Amash, and there were a few other seemingly good congressmen there asking questions, but you even had congressmen there who had no idea where countries were where U.S. troops were being deployed. And this is explicitly their role in the Constitution to do this. And so I think that's why overall, the results of whatever the midterms are really won't impact foreign policy all too much. One fear I have is that if this is another 2016 scenario and unexpectedly the Republicans end up holding both the House and the Senate, who knows who the Democrats are going to blame, whether it be the Russians or I suppose, they may blame some, domestic sources as well. But this, we could see a real overreaction here from the left. And I gotta say, I'm really concerned. And I know there's, some of the best people on Russiagate are the principled leftists like Gareth Porter and Glenn Greenwald. But largely, the whatever percentage makeup of, hardened Democrat supporters, they're going to go along with whatever, Russia-phobic excuse is given to them by party leadership, and they're going to demand a more hostile policy against Russia at the same time when, the president that I think in a lot of ways they rightfully call an idiot is preparing a new arms race with Russia. This is a completely insane perfect storm that could cause another Cold War completely unnecessarily. And it just makes the whole fact that, we're supposed to have this great, valuable democracy so disappointing that it's not like if the Democrats take back the House and the Senate, they're going to force Donald Trump to end all of his unconstitutional wars and interventions. They're going to go after the power of that Republican president and rein it in. No, they're just going to give him more and more power. They continue to sign, National Defense Authorization Acts and FAA reauthorization acts that give the executive branch more and more power, even though it's a Republican in charge. And so I think on the most important issues, most of the time they're wrong. And, it doesn't really matter who takes power. It is unfortunate. I think there's a lot of hate that's created around these elections. People just get so passionate about it. And, there's all these big stints made every time about how, on the right, I think you have the more extremist points constantly being made that if the Democrats take charge, then they're going to let in 20 million immigrants and a Republican will never win a House seat or a presidency again. And then you have, the left-wing position that, if the Republicans win, then women will lose the right to vote. These are overreactions, but then, everybody gets in all this, hate and hostility around it. And, at the end of the day, we don't ever actually change the most important policies. Of course, the biggest parts of the budget, in a lot of ways is the war budget and the war debt. When you're looking at, what causes the most harm to U.S. citizens. I mean, if you look at what's happened to all the veterans and then the negative impacts, the the very serious injuries they sustain have on their family and friends. It's hard to pick something other than, the wars that have really harmed so many Americans. Hell, even the ones that stay in the United States and fly the drones end up developing PTSD and what Peter Van Buren so rightly calls moral injury. And I will say, in all my negativity about politics, there are sometimes good things that do happen. If I were living in a state where any laws ending prohibitions or decriminalizing, drugs and, encouraging rehabilitation. Those are things that, I think would be worth supporting. We have this new right to try bill that passed Congress. I think this is a big deal. It basically gives people who are terminally ill the right to try drugs without the FDA's approval. And so, I do think there are real gains to be made by politics, even if it isn't the foreign policy field. So that's, if you feel like it's worth voting, if you're living in a state where you could vote for somebody or something that would really advance the cause of, freedom, liberty, and the end of the empire, then, go out and do it. But I don't think that's often the situation presented to many of us on the ballot. I will say a couple things on the political horizon that I do think are productive, and absent of whatever happens in the, midterm elections here, I do think we may get a political solution to the, kind of U.S. support for Saudi Arabia and possibly an end to the war in Yemen or U.S. weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. The war is too horrific, for people to not continue to notice, and the Khashoggi murder has cast a negative enough light on Saudi Arabia, that I do think people could fall out of line with the kingdom right now. I'm talking people, senators and representatives, that we may have a chance to really move that direction. And also marijuana legalization. I think that's probably on the horizon. We have now Canada and Mexico legalizing it. So I think it's going to be harder and harder, for these states to not start to legalize it, and eventually a legalization on the national level. My guess is it'll progress a little bit, like we saw with the gay marriage movement, ballot initiatives in some cases, maybe state legislators, making the decision in some cases, and then possibly even court rulings. That's funny enough how it ends up being legalized in Mexico. Also, the incoming president did voice his support for this policy, so that's a good thing to hear. But again, I think these are absent whatever happens right now in these 2018 elections. I think it more has to do not just with the sentiment of the American people, but just the general exposure among Republicans and Democrats to these issues, helping them to realize that the correct thing to do is legalize marijuana and end the war in Yemen. A couple notes on the border. This is another issue that actually would, I think, be impacted a little bit by the midterm. So if you're a big immigration person, then again, you're probably going to be somebody that cares a little bit more about this thing. But I'm seeing reports that about $200 million could be spent on the Pentagon deployment of around 15,000 troops to the southern border. Complete waste of money. The Pentagon also, sources from the Pentagon said that the White House asked the soldiers to take on some law enforcement roles, and that they said they're not going to do that. I guess there's a principle, there's some Latin phrase for it that says that, military don't perform policing roles at home. And, this is, I think, a doctrine of the U.S. military, and probably something that's culturally believed in the military still. And for this reason, we may not see them performing law enforcement duties, at least not law enforcement duties pointed inward to the United States. My guess is that they'll be more on intercepting people before they enter the country, or identifying where people could enter the country, and then providing other assistance in either, building barricades, walls, destroying tunnels, and some of that kind of stuff. But at least according to this story, the Pentagon did reject it. I guess it's just always worth noting that with as much, I believe, false reporting from anonymous sources that has come out over the course of the Trump presidency, it's always worth it to mention when it is an anonymous source that there's a potential that is false here. All right, Iranian sanctions went in place yesterday. It looks like the U.S. gave waivers to 8 countries. Those countries were not explicitly named by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo when he announced there was 8 countries receiving waivers. At least 2 of those countries have been identified as China and India. From my understanding, at least Turkey is saying that they got a waiver as well. The waivers were for 8 jurisdictions, so people are speculating this means that Taiwan also got a waiver, because that would be the language that the United States would use to, avoid upsetting China too much here. Russia has said that they're going to continue to trade Iranian oil, so my guess would be Russia probably got a sanction, or at the very least, all the people that would be sanctioned here are already sanctioned, just because of the huge number of sanctions the United States has placed on Russia over mostly hysterical political reactions to the Ukrainian civil war and the 2016 election. And I did get into this in my little rant on politics before, but I do want to mention that Gareth Porter wrote a follow-up to his article in Consortium News about the minuscule influence that the alleged Russian-linked Facebook and Twitter accounts could have possibly had on the 2016 election. And in this article, Gareth explains that and just a little bit more about really how unimportant those alleged accounts were to having any influence in the 2016 election. And I will link to that in the show notes page. Pompeo did say that those waivers are temporary and that 6 countries had agreed to reduce their imports of Iranian oil and 2 agreed that they would completely stop it. Pompeo did make, I don't want to say an explicit threat, but, definitely mentioned that SWIFT, which is the European banking entity that I would guess facilitate these oil transactions in US dollars, the U.S. said that you better stop doing business with the Iranians, and I believe the U.S. will be able to control this. I think the important thing that are yet to see play out, but already have a little bit with some countries defying the U.S. sanctions here, is that, the American hegemony over having the world's reserve currency and having oil traded in dollars, I think is going to, start to be very shaky. With, I think, the decline in overall U.S. hegemonic power, and with the United States continuing to make impossible demands and having such an erratic and illogical and destabilizing foreign policy, that more countries are going to, start to bite the bullet and try to, break away from the United States world ruling order. It'll be interesting to see how this is facilitated, whether it's other countries looking to move against the U.S. at the UN, maybe stripping the Security Council of the permanent states of their, extreme power to control the world. But, it'll be very interesting to see what happens. But this is just another huge amount of pressure the United States is putting on the rest of the global community. In such a pointless one as well. The Iranians aren't trying to make nukes. This is all stupid. And very ashamed that this is like kind of the one part of the, Trump policy from the candidacy that he has seemed to have held. We stayed in Afghanistan. There's no grand bargain between the Israelis and the Palestinians. He didn't end NATO, but he does follow through on his pledge to get rid of the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal, which was one of the few decent things that Obama actually did. Last thing I'll note is that Pompeo said that these sanctions are not going to hurt ordinary Iranians. This is a straight up lie. The sanctions are going to end up hurting the ordinary people the most. This is what happens every single time. You could just look what happened next door with the U.S. sanctions on Iraq during the Clinton era, where you had 300,000 to 500,000 children succumb to the deprivation because of those sanctions. And so, if the United States is able to have a full-on blockade of Iran, who knows how many Iranian children end up dying? And of course, this isn't going to be a great motivator for the Iranian people to overthrow their government. Just like America would respond to a hostile attack from the outside, I think you would probably see more nationalism, more devotion to the central government, and, less, probably instability for them, and, a less pressure for liberalization of the country. Talking about Trump's candidacy, one of the things he did talk about was withdrawing from Afghanistan. Tucker Carlson, who, I guess of everybody on cable news, is probably the most watchable for me. I know some of his takes are terrible, but occasionally he does have a really good take, like on Afghanistan. He's calling on President Trump to end that war. So, really, this is something to be applauded, and it'd be great to see the U.S. get out of Afghanistan, because as I was mentioning before, insider attacks now, U.S. soldiers dying when they're, Afghans that I guess they're training or working alongside are turning their guns on them. I've heard several veterans point out that, this is incredibly harmful to the relationship and the nation building efforts of the U.S. And I'm guessing that if the Taliban sees success with it, they're going to continue and possibly even increase it. We even have the commander of U.S. forces who, of course, we had to remember, I believe, was shot in his body armor in an insider attack a few weeks ago, now saying that he believes there is no military solution for Afghanistan. Now, I don't think he's actually advocating a withdrawal, and that doesn't mean to him what it means to me. But I do think this is a good sign that maybe even the military is getting tired of this war. And, even if we don't completely withdraw from Afghanistan, maybe realizing that it's not worth it to try to control Helmand and Kandahar and all these Pashtun strongholds, and really look for a situation where even if there's not a complete end to the war, there could at least be a reduction in tensions and fighting. I want to wrap up talking about Yemen, and just not too much detail, but we know that the offensive for the city of Hodeidah is going on. Hodeidah is a key port city in Yemen. It's the only port in Yemen that could offload these massive cargo ships. Of course, its ability to offload cargo ships has been reduced by Saudi Arabia destroying the dock equipment. However, still a very critical port to gain aid to Yemen. I believe the figure is about 80% of the necessary medicine and fuel that comes into Yemen does so through this port. So far, since 2015, this port has been controlled by the Houthis. However, the Saudi-backed coalition and their hired mercenaries and support from the Yemeni army has been attacking this city for a few months now. I believe the UAE is really driving the ground assault here. Up until a few days ago, really up until the Mattis announcement that there needs to be a ceasefire in 30 days, there's been little to no progress made by the Saudi coalition. Of course, the U.S. plays a key role in this coalition. However, in the past couple of days, it seems Saudi Arabia is making a huge push. They haven't made any progress up the coastline of the city. They're attacking the city from the south, but they have made some progress to the east of the city, again taking the highway that connects Hodeidah with the capital city and Houthi-controlled capital city of Sana'a, and advanced even a little bit further than north along the eastern side of the city. It'll be interesting to see if they're able to make any success in the city, attacking it from maybe different positions. If you listen to some reporting by Nasser Arabi, who I'm sure that one day historically his interviews with Scott Horton on the Yemen war will be extremely important to understanding what the hell happened here and how the world let this absolutely horrific war go on, and even the world superpowers like the United States and the United Kingdom went along and supported this. But he really lays out that a lot of the people left in the city are Houthi sympathetic people, and it looks like it's going to be probably real nasty fighting going on here. I'm not sure if it's going to be to the levels that we saw like in Mosul or Raqqa or Aleppo, but it does seem like very nasty fighting to come, where you have an insurgency. This time it'll be the Houthis trying to defend the city from the, very weak ground force. In this case, I think that the Saudi coalition has cobbled together. A lot of Sudanese mercenaries there, maybe some Al-Qaeda linked fighters, some fighters still supportive, of Yemeni descent, either more there just because they're paid or because they're true believers in the Hadi, the Saudi or the Emirati mission, or just opposed to the Houthis, make up this army that hasn't seemed very strong. And so I'm sure it will be massively reliant on air power from Saudi Arabia. Of course, with those U.S. planes, we're feeling the Saudi planes as they drop their bombs on the, poor Yemeni people who are either stuck in the city or, just those who are driving school buses and get blown up that way. All right, I guess that's where I'll wrap up my show for today. I hope you all enjoyed it. And that rant in the beginning about politics wasn't too off-putting, but again, for those of you who are supporting the show on Patreon, I really do appreciate it. If you have any ideas on, what you would like to see as rewards for the patrons. Message me about that, and I will set that up. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, immersionnews.com, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus, at KYAAALE on Twitter, Immersion News on Minds. Everybody go back to Minds. Facebook thoughts, I don't want to do it anymore. So probably going to be getting off that soon. But I definitely want to shift over to Minds for a lot of that stuff. And so I'm at Immersion News there. Check it out. Hope you enjoy it.